Sadly, sometimes it feels like there's a new scandal in church every single day. Today, more than ever, we hear stories of spiritual abuse, toxic leadership environments, and all kinds of stuff that shouldn't be going on in churches, yet we find out it is. It's devastating. It's shocking. And it can be a real jolt to your faith. And in this episode of the Church Disrupted podcast, we interview Laura McKnight Barringer to talk about things like church abuse, toxic church cultures, narcissistic systems, and how we can trade them all in for a good church culture instead. Laura's actually co-authored a couple of different books with her father, Scott McKnight, on this very subject, and this interview, this conversation was powerful. So if you're like us and you're ready to trade in all these junk news stories about spiritual abuse and trauma in churches, and you're ready to trade it for a good church culture, for the church to be restored to the pure and spotless bride that we were called to be, for the church to return to being a bright light, a city on a hill, the hope of the world. If you want to see those things again, then you're going to love this conversation as we talk about how to make that trade, how we can recognize and get rid of spiritual abuse and toxic environments, and instead create good Tove cultures in our churches. So if that's you and you're ready, let's jump in together to today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran, and I am pumped about this interview today. This is one I've been waiting on for a while. We've actually got author Laura McKnight Barringer. She's co-authored two incredible books that have had a huge impact on me and on the work of Church Disrupted. She's co-authored those with her dad, Scott McKnight, A Church Called Tove, and Pivot. And Laura, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today. I've been looking forward to this conversation for so long because those books are packed with information about how to recognize spiritual abuse, how we got here. They've got a lot of empathy in them, which I really appreciate. And then Pivot is full of kind of the way forward and how we can create healthier churches. So I'm pumped about this conversation. Thank you for being here. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your origin story? Because when we talk about things like church hurt and spiritual abuse, one of the things I've realized is we all have an origin story. There's a moment that woke us up to this kind of monster under the bed. There was a moment where we didn't know, and the next moment we did know something had to be done. So what was kind of your origin story to this world of spiritual abuse and that started you and your dad on this work that you guys have done through these books?
Well, hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be with you and your listeners today. And I'm a little distracted by that word pivot above your head. I don't know if your viewers can see video or not, but the word pivot is floating above.
Yeah, they can.
At the moment. It looks like maybe Friends pivot. So you talked about a moment.
It is Friends pivot for sure.
I have a series of moments. This is not a path that I ever planned to take. I could not have planned to take the path that I'm on. I'm a public school teacher and I'm a Wheaton College graduate from their education department. And I planned and have spent my 20-year career thus far as a primary grades teacher. And so speaking and writing about spiritual abuse is I still sometimes am flabbergasted that, I spend my days in kindergarten and then my evenings and weekends speaking and writing about this topic. My moment was March 23, 2018. I live in the suburbs of Chicago, and an article broke here in the Chicago Tribune about my former church, Willow Creek, and my former pastor, Bill Hybels. And my husband and I happened to be out to dinner when the story broke, and my parents sent us a link to the article. And I read the headline out loud to him, and it had something to do with sexual abuse allegations. And we kind of were like, rolled our eyes. He's like, oh, that's been floating around for years, and put my phone away, finished dinner. And then as we were driving home, it's probably my second moment, I started reading the article out loud to Mark, my husband, and our mouths dropped open because we knew the names, not just knew the names, we knew the majority of the women who were making accusations.
Oh, wow.
And we knew, like, these are not like, the church had painted them as like they were lying, they were colluding to ruin Bill's reputation before he retired. And that never settled well with us because they have no reason to do that. These are not people who would make up stories for attention to take Bill down for no reason. They're women of character and integrity.
Hmm.
Betty Schmidt, one of the elders who I didn't know well at the time, but she was mentioned in the article, and she is hugely respected at Willow Creek. By my husband had known her, so it just did not settle well. We ended up coming home, talking to my parents on the phone, and this is probably my next moment, as you mentioned, is my dad said, you guys, this story is true. He said, Willow Creek's in big trouble if they don't respond
Hmm.
more compassionately. And he said, I've seen this hundreds of times. This is a typical pattern. And um, there's just too many women for it to be a complete made up story. Maybe like every now and then you have one or two people that make something up for attention, but not eight
Yeah.
different stories that have happened over a period of time.
And it sounds like
So,
your dad noticed the playbook as well, because there's a very specific way that churches tend to respond to these allegations. So when you see some of those responses, it's also a red flag of,
mhm,
hey, maybe some of this is true, even if we don't want to believe it.
right. So time went on, and you're right, it is a typical pattern, and it was a red flag for him right away. I was naive to this sort of thing at the time. I naively just thought, oh, churches would tell the truth. The elders, the pastors, they tell the truth. Um, and it was really disorienting for both my husband and for me. We
Mm.
we would look at each other and be like, I remember this moment. I was sitting in my living room couch. I was like, only one side is telling the truth. If the church
Yeah.
is telling the truth, that's really disturbing about these women that my family's known for a long time. If the church is not telling the truth, like, I don't even know what to do with that. I don't have a frame of reference for a church lying. So, we all know how the story ends. One thing led to the next. My dad ended up writing the church was, in fact, lying to protect Bill and his reputation. And um, the false narratives, that was the first chapter we wrote in a church called Tove. Those largely came out of a book that my dad was reading. It happened to be about the German pastor's response to the Holocaust and the overlap
Mm.
of the narratives that we were seeing come out of Willow Creek. But I was not a plan for me to be involved. I wanted him to write the book. He's the author. But as time went on, we decided to do it together.
Kind of a funny aside, when I first listened to A Church Called Tove, I was listening to the audiobook before I went back and reread it, because a lot of times it's how I'll start. And just a moment of levity, you were telling that story, about you and Mark, being at dinner and having that concern, but it was read by a male narrator. So I got very confused there for a moment when I heard it the first time. So that was funny. Every time it switched to you after that, I would be like, okay, I got to remember this is a male narrator who's narrating for Laura. This is Laura now, not Scott. Um, but it's tough when you see these things. Most of us don't have a framework, like you said, for churches lying, for pastors lying, because we want to believe and should be able to believe that we can trust our pastors, we can trust our leaders. You guys had been at Willow Creek, it sounds like, for a really long time. So this was your church, this was your pastor. If it hadn't have been for you knowing a lot of these women, that natural response that a lot of us have, I think, was your first response, which was,
Mhm.
if I didn't know these people, oh, then the response is probably people are just making this up. Why do you think that's so easily our first response? Because that's a response that I see all too often. It breaks my heart, but I've responded that way in the past before I knew what I knew now.
I think there's a number of reasons. This happened a lot in my personal story with Willow Creek. I had friends who said to me, "Why are you doing this? Why are you saying things that will hurt Willow Creek?" And I think that's a big part of it is they didn't want to hurt the church. Um, we had somebody write my dad and said, "I know Bill did not do these things because I've been with him on trips and he was way too busy to do any of this that these women are saying that he did." Um, I think it's you see the good, a lot of good came and still comes out of Willow Creek. And people think,
Yeah.
well, there can't possibly be a dark or a shadow side because there's so much good coming out of it. So another pattern that I've noticed understandably is like it hurts too much to believe. If
Hmm.
I believe that this is true, what else is not true? Was it all a show? Like is does it put my faith at risk? I have so much empathy and compassion for those that have struggled with their responses, their faith responses to situations like this. And I think that that's a big part of it is that it is just too painful to accept that it's true.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's almost, in a lot of ways, it's a defense mechanism that
Mhm.
we fight believing it, because it's easier to believe that a friend is in the wrong or someone we don't know is in the wrong, just trying to trash the church, than it is to believe that a church or spiritual leaders that our identity was connected to are wrong, because that means we were wrong for a long time, and that's it causes cognitive dissonance. That's difficult to deal with. That's one of the things that we hear most often. Since we started speaking out about spiritual abuse and the systems that cause it, we get a lot of feedback of, "Hey, you guys are just hurting the church. You're causing division," and it's a constant, just kind of reminder, trying to remind people with empathy that speaking out against systems is not hurting the church. But when we don't speak out against systems and people that hurt the bride, the actual people of the bride, that is hurting the church. And it seems like we have a really hard time as modern Christians separating the institution of the church from the people of the church. Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. When we think about spiritual abuse, Laura, a lot of people think about this a lot of different ways. There's different definitions floating around. Just kind of in a layman's way of describing it, how would you define spiritual abuse for someone who's unfamiliar with it?
I would define it as it's an abuse of power by a person or system in a spiritual position over another. So if I am misusing the Bible to on purpose to misrepresent who I am or to have you be quiet, that is a form of spiritual abuse. But at its essence, I believe it is the misuse of power of a person or system that has spiritual authority over another. Do you agree?
Yeah, you can't have spiritual abuse that I've found that doesn't start with an abuse of power.
Hmm.
So like I love, Justin Humphrey and Lisa Oakley's
Yes.
definition. It's so long that it loses a lot of people. That's where I start because there's so many different markers, but all of those markers I think are described by an abuse of power. Someone had power over another and misused that in a spiritual way. So I think that's a great way of describing it. Now, let's get another definition if we can, just to set listeners up. Some of our listeners have read your books, others haven't. And that word Tove is one that we're not going to be familiar with if you're not familiar with, Hebrew language. So talk to us about what is Tove and what is a culture of Tove? Why is that so important for the modern church to espouse and to really start running toward?
Tov is a beautiful little 3-letter Hebrew word, and it means goodness. And what I have come to understand from my father, the theologian, is that this little word Tov is found hundreds of times in our Bible. And it is found, I believe, I don't know, 7, I'm probably saying the wrong number, but a lot, even on just page 1 of Genesis. So God
Yes.
saw creation was Tov, the land, the light, the animals were Tov. All that he made was good. It was Tov. And I have learned as well that everything God made is Tov, that he in essence is good. He is Tov, that Jesus embodied Tove, and he is our shepherd. He is our good shepherd. Our Bible is
Yeah.
literally the good news is the book of Tove. And
Mm,
so my dad started noticing when he would use this word Tove or goodness with his seminary students that it was quite catchy, and that they would start using it and it became part of their regular vocabulary. And when he
love
responded
it.
in the article to Willow Creek and wrote about goodness, he noticed that there was like a craving from people to learn more about this major moral category in our Bible. And that's where the whole it became a framework for the book. Our publisher initially said, oh, a church called Tov. Well, first of all, they thought it sounded too much like the book A Man Called Ove, um, which I know I'm mispronouncing. It's like Ova in Swedish, but that's how I was like, that's what people,
Hmm.
Americans butcher it. And my dad was like, oh, don't worry. Nobody's ever heard of that book. I was like, oh, it's only a New York Times bestseller. But anyways, and then they said, well, we don't use Hebrew words in our titles. And he replied with, well, just try it. Like, try it around your office for a week or two and see what people think. And they came back and said, okay, we'll use it in the title. Um, but the whole book we wanted to write a redemptive book. We didn't want to just write
Yeah.
expose. There's a little bit of that, but we didn't want to just call out the problems, the things that are wrong. We wanted to offer hope for a better way, for that which would resist what is toxic. So this moral category of goodness that we find all over our Bible became the framework for the every chapter.
I love it. It's caught on with me. I think about goodness differently now after, reading the book. I think about, you know, Tove is something it's really caught on to my language and my expression, but I have to watch out who I'm using it with because there has to be an explanation if they've never
Yeah,
heard it before. So
yeah.
thank you so much for, for sharing that. Now, one of the things that shows up in a lot of spiritual abuse cases, you guys talk about this early in a book called Tove, is narcissistic leaders, narcissism showing up in both the leaders and the systems. So, what are some of the features that you've noticed of narcissistic pastors? Now, this may be long before they're abusers. We're not saying that every pastor who has these features is an abuser. But what are some of the features you've noticed of narcissistic pastors that can lead to abuse if unchecked?
A desire for glory, um, of themselves, not Christ. A complete lack of empathy for those that they lead, those that they serve. feels like there's a little bit like a lack of conscience, like I'm above I can do these things. I can do what I want because I'm better than everybody else. Um, I've really come to appreciate the beautiful work of Chuck DeGroat. In case you're not familiar,
Yes.
yes, when narcissism comes to church, and I've developed I've developed compassion, um, understanding the shame that's beneath it. Like at one point, I said, this was early on in the Willow story. I thought, gosh, if Bill Hybels would come to Willow and confess and repent, I have to believe the church would erupt with grace. I can see a vision of it, like people standing up and
Yeah.
offering him forgiveness. And I thought I was in conversations with therapists, and I said, why doesn't he do it? You know, we're like begging him to repent. And
Yeah.
the therapist said, the shame is too great. And I've never forgotten that. And I appreciate Chuck DeGroat's work, because I feel like I understand like the shame underneath it. With most narcissistic
Yeah.
stories, that's where it begins. Um, but how it manifests is just running rampant over people.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest red flags is the lack of empathy and concern for other people.
Yeah. Well, and this is, one of those places we talked about this a little bit just before we started the interview. But one of the gifts that I'm trying to give to our audience is just the gift of vulnerability, being honest. And, I've talked about, my bouts with narcissism in the past, because narcissism isn't, for most people, a diagnosis. It's a spectrum. It took a year of therapy and a PTSD diagnosis to realize how I was operating out of shame and how that had me really much higher than I wanted to be on the narcissism scale. Once I dealt with that shame, and once I, had to come to grips with it and kind of humbly confess that, the way that I was showing up in the world, it totally changed who I was. But for a lot of narcissistic leaders and narcissistic pastors, there's never a moment where they're able to deal with that shame, where they feel like they have
Mhm.
a safe place to deal with that shame. So, it's one of those things. I really think, Laura, if we could begin to recognize it in ourselves and our leaders and our systems earlier, and we would require people to get help over that, that it would eliminate a lot of the abuse. But a lot of the abuse comes from narcissism unchecked. So that lack of empathy is definitely something that I've seen not only in others, but that was something that I had to deal with looking in the mirror, years ago, that has totally transformed my life. Now, you can have a narcissistic leader, but you can also have a toxic Christian workplace. That could be a nonprofit, that could be a church. That's where, a lot of these, spiritual abuse is generally going to happen more often than not in a Christian workplace. What are some of the kind of key features or key red flags of a toxic Christian workplace that you guys have seen through your work?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for your honesty and humility, Jeff. I'm really touched. I'm very moved by your story, and um, I don't want to use the word applaud, but I'm so grateful for the self-reflection and the work that you've done, and how you can now use that pain from where you've come to help other people. Um, it doesn't happen very often, so thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
toxic church culture. When we started writing A Church Called Tove, these things kind of emerged. It started with the book that my dad had been reading about the Holocaust and how the German pastors responded. I saw the patterns coming out of Willow Creek. Harvest Bible Church is down the road from us. That was James McDonald. That started imploding shortly after the Willow Creek story became public. Um, I then you've got the Southern Baptist Convention, the Catholic churches. Like all of a sudden, I was like, my eyes became open. That this is far bigger of a story and far bigger of a problem than Willow Creek. And so we started studying
Yeah.
the patterns that we were seeing, and a few emerged. The narcissistic culture, these are what would be considered toxic. The narcissistic culture, people are afraid. They're afraid of speaking up because of ramifications or repercussions, or that there be some kind of revenge on them if they tell the truth. We saw a tendency to put, like with Willow Creek, put the institution, the church, or the organization's reputation above people.
Yeah.
Rather than telling the truth, a toxic environment will create, like they'll spin a story. So there might be a little bit of truth, but really what it is a false narrative. We saw this happen to me with Willow Creek too, is people that I knew were very loyal to the organization and to the culture, and they had to be, because if they were not loyal, they would be isolated, they would be shunned. But that loyalty culture is toxic. Celebrity culture, from mega church culture, from which I'm familiar, but that celebrity culture is toxic. And then the leadership culture of a church we found to be toxic as well. So those are the patterns that we saw emerge from workplaces that reeked of toxicity.
Well, those are all spot on, from my experience. As you're saying those, I'm going, yeah, I've seen this in this situation. I've seen this one, and celebrity culture specifically. We're going to be doing some work in the summer, some podcast series called the Church the Celebrity Built, because it has done a lot of damage, even unforeseen damage. So we have a lot of church staff who listen, and they can't tell their pastors that they listen, because if they did, they'd get in trouble. But we have a lot of church staff that say, hey, I'm trying to navigate, am I in a spiritually abusive environment or not? A lot of what you guys talk about on the podcast gives us language. It gives us questions to ask, things to do. So for church staff that doesn't have a lot of authority, these are your youth pastors, your kids pastors, your interns, your everyday church staff. What are some of the earliest warning signs that a culture's turning toxic before it becomes abusive? What are those warning signs that would say, hey, it's headed that way if something doesn't change?
Can you get to the pastor? Can you have a conversation, or is he or she too important? Are you afraid? Are you afraid to speak up? And if so, why? I mean, it could just be because you have an anxious personality like I do, and maybe you're afraid to speak up. But on the other hand, maybe you're afraid to speak because you're afraid of the repercussions that could happen. Have you seen people on staff disappear and not be told why? When you ask them why they leave, can they
That's a
talk
huge
about
one.
it? Yeah.
That's a huge one. Or when you ask why someone left, does the story feel wrong? Does it feel spun and sanitized and like there's something they're not telling you? That was one of our first red flags, that it just felt like there was a positive story that didn't make sense to all of these people who were leaving.
Yeah, I remember, I apologize. I hope I don't sound overly harsh on Willow Creek. It's my personal story, so I tend to gravitate towards what I saw there. I know people can change. I know churches can change, and I do really hope that Willow Creek will heal and can heal. I believe it can. But that would happen all the time at Willow, is like this person God called them elsewhere. And all of a sudden they were moving from Chicago to Michigan, and we were all standing up applauding for the great work they had done. And I thought, that's odd. Like, God just called them here 8 months ago. It didn't feel quite right. But it was spun in a positive way. And then some of those people, we found out later, were given non-disclosure agreements and could not talk. They could not tell the truth of what happened. That's a huge red flag.
Yeah. When I left on my own, and left because there were just some irreconcilable differences. I couldn't stay on the church staff anymore, but wanted to leave in a good way. But everything was spun positively. And I remember, Laura, I couldn't even tell my volunteers. I was a small groups pastor at the time. I couldn't tell my volunteers. I had to stand beside my campus pastor while he told the volunteers exactly what he was told. Even when I transitioned from one role to another years before, We had over 200 volunteers and, 600 plus students. And I had to stand on stage while someone else told my story that people applauded. And it was a false story. We couldn't say anything about it at the time because if I did, I'd lose my job. But the story was false. The truth was I was in trouble because I asked the wrong questions. I was being punished as I was being sent somewhere else. But it was this, hey, let's erupt in applause. Let's celebrate. So I've experienced that multiple times in that system. But we had heard about NDAs, but I hadn't seen NDAs until, a few years later. My wife was actually let go from a counseling position at a church. And when she was let go from the counseling position at the church, they gave her an NDA. And that was really about a year ago now. That was when we said, hey, we have to do something more because there's so much more to this than we had realized because we didn't sign the NDA. We actually, we tried to get a private meeting and couldn't to talk about it. So we published the NDA and since then have done a lot of work and have found it's industry standard in a lot of churches. But we don't know. So a lot of these people can't say this story's false. What they're saying is not true. Otherwise, they have legal repercussions that could come their way. They could be sued. They could lose their severance money that they need to take care of their family. So there's a lot of fear involved in that. But I find that most people have no idea that their tithe money could have been used for things like hush money payments with NDAs.
We were astounded. My dad and I, we did not know that churches were using NDAs. Our jaws dropped open when people would tell us, we're like, where did this musician go? Well, she can't say because of attorney reasons. She signed a non-disclosure. And we're like, what? What does that even mean? And we came to understand that basically it was a bribe. It was a bribe that prohibited the person from telling the truth. And it's a way that churches get people to be quiet to protect their reputation. One of the women that I respect greatly, she's a hero of my faith from the Willow Creek story, was offered an astronomical amount of money to be quiet about what Bill had done to her. And she refused to accept the money. She said, I'm not taking this money. There's no way. And and then they told her, you need to take this money or we will ruin your reputation. And she said, no,
Yeah.
I will not take the money. But, not everybody has the mental faculty under duress to be able to recognize what's happening, to recognize they're just trying to make me be quiet. They're too afraid. Or sadly, Willow Creek would sometimes hold a person's severance over them. So they would say, we'll give you this severance, but you need to sign this first. And you can understand why people sign them because they're put under it. They're put in a horrible situation, impossible situation.
And a lot of times you're given the NDA 5 minutes after you've been fired unexpectedly.
Right.
So you're dealing with the shock, you're dealing with all that. And I haven't seen very many NDAs that are given on the back end that aren't tied to a severance, which is why I call it hush money, because it is a bribe for your silence.
It's my dad used the term Christian bribery.
Yes. Which I listened to, an episode of a podcast where, your dad was talking with Bosavijan. We've actually used that on a little bit of a docuseries, some of those quotes that we did on NDAs. I've seen a ton of them now. Most of them actually prohibit the signer from even talking about the existence of an NDA. So what you were told, they can't talk about that because of an NDA.
Yeah, they can't even say that it exists.
That's right. The whole agreement shrouded in secrecy. So because more people are starting to talk about them, there have been not many, but just a few that have done damage to the system because we've actually said, hey, here are these NDAs, we're not signing them. What a lot of churches are doing now is they're tucking them in the employee handbook. So you may have a 150-page employee handbook that most people are not going to read all the way through when they start a new job and are excited. And they'll have multiple confidentiality clauses so that when you get fired, they don't even have to hold the severance. If they don't want to, they can simply say, hey, remember when you signed this? We can take legal action if you share anything. Because I know I've seen a few handbooks where it says basically, if it hasn't been announced on Sunday morning, it's confidential. So if we haven't announced it on Sunday morning, you can't talk about it or you could be in trouble. And then beyond that, and this is something that's just most people don't know, it's so crazy. Churches have the option to pay into unemployment insurance or not. The majority of churches do not. So when a person gets fired, if they don't take that severance, there's no other way to make money. So if they were already living paycheck to paycheck, which a lot of pastors are, especially lower level staff, they can't go draw unemployment. They can't go file. They can't do any of that. So they're oftentimes kind of over a barrel and making the choice, do I take care of my family or do I tell the truth? But that confidentiality is only one-sided because those churches can assassinate the character and often do over time, slowly, of that person. So it starts with, hey, let's applaud. They left for good reasons. They're called away. And then for the next 3 years, the pastors will talk about, hey, well, they had a heart problem with money. That's the real reason why they left. They just always wanted more money, things like that. And you can't speak back to it. We didn't sign the NDA and we still get stories all the time. We heard a story this past week at the new church that we're attending. We ran into someone from the old church and they literally said, hey, this one pastor is telling people that they're really hurt that you guys did this because they bought your house. And I'm like, what are we talking about? Nobody ever bought any house, right? So the stories get outlandish that start getting thrown and brandished around. And if you sign an NDA, you can't say a word. You actually have to agree with whatever's been thrown out. So we've seen a lot of damage done to people and their reputations and communities, even after they've signed these NDAs, because they don't go both ways. But I want to talk about, you mentioned this as well. This connects to NDAs. A lot of people don't speak up because there's so much fear there. There's a lot of different things that cause it. Why do you think more people don't speak up and speak out? Because there's a lot more victims of spiritual abuse than we know about today. They've been silenced for a lot of different reasons. What are the biggest reasons you see that actually keep them silent?
Look what happens when they do speak out. The backlash is sometimes more traumatizing than the initial abuse. Rachel Denhollinger said, whom I respect greatly, one of the leading voices on this topic, said, the church is the most unsafe place to tell the truth about abuse that has happened within it.
Yeah.
And I think that's like, why would you want to? Now when I hear a story, I think now I know that 98% of the times people speaking out about abuse are telling the truth. Like it's probably very likely that it's true, but look at the cost to the victim. So they suffered the initial abuse, probably suffered and tried to heal in silence, maybe hopefully with the support of a therapist. And then for whatever reason, they bravely decide to come forward and they're met with anger, with disbelief. Suddenly they're the oppressor instead of the one who actually committed the abuse. People coming forward to tell their stories are extraordinarily brave. But I also understand why people wouldn't want to, because what happened with the Willow Creek women, the traumatization was just as bad, if not worse, than the initial abuse that was done to them.
And a lot of times if you were on church staff and you come forward, you probably won't find another church job, or they'll be very, very limited as well. You talked a little bit about like your dad recognized the playbook. He recognized, it's what I call the playbook, but the responses that tend to come from a lot of these systems to protect pastors when they're accused. What have you seen? Because you guys have done a lot of this work now. You've seen a lot of different churches. What generally have you seen that happens when a pastor is accused? Whether they're guilty, whether they're not, but what is that response from people inside the system?
So I've seen this a number of times. It's like every time, like the same thing happens, but I'm always surprised, like who takes which side. But sadly, there's division. You always have people that believe the victims, and then there's always a contingent that circle the wagons around the pastor and the institution. And they fiercely and harshly defend and then end up re-wounding, intentionally or not, re-wounding the victims in the process. And then the false narratives spin out of control, and then people take sides, and relationships are ruined and destroyed. And I just saw it happen again. I thought, here we go again. It's the same pattern. It's the same emotion, feelings of anger, feelings of betrayal and sadness. And then the people that took the side of the pastor, I thought, man, like, they don't believe that it was bad enough that the pastor should have been removed from his position or whatever it is. It's a typical pattern. It always surprises me, and it saddens me who ends up on which side. And relationships are destroyed. And I think, goodness, if the truth there should only be one side ever. And that should be the truth. There shouldn't be like,
Yeah.
he said, she said. It should just be, well, what is the truth? And we should all be on the side of truth telling.
Yeah. A lot of churches want to go to, it seems like, internal investigations and quickly discredit, the accusation. Why do you think so few churches are willing to go the extra step to bring someone in for an independent investigation? Because again, if we're wanting truth, like, even think about Willow Creek and Bill Hybels' situation, if those were false accusations, which they've been proven not to be, but if they were false accusations, he should have wanted, I would think, someone to do an independent investigation and kind of clear him of that. Why do you think so few churches are willing to do that and bring someone else in?
When I hear that a church has decided to do an internal investigation, my red flags go up, because I think, well, why? What is the motive behind investigating yourself? From what I've seen, it's a red flag, because internal investigations often are shams. They're conducted by internal people who are supportive of the abuser, who are trying to protect him or her and the system.
Yeah, because
So,
they benefit from the system generally.
correct. So for me, it's a huge red flag to hear, well, we need an investigation, but we're going to do it internally. I would ask why. Why is it being done internally? Why is an outside investigation not being done? Best practices outside.
Well, it just removes, so many of the opportunities and the temptation, to cover things up or to,
Mhm.
spin a narrative. And again, if we don't have anything to hide, I actually think it's liberating, for us. We want
Mhm.
someone else to come in and put their stamp on that. Um, it seems like most of the spiritual abuse cases that have come up in recent years, that they're always a surprise. Yet once we start finding out the things that have come out about it, these behaviors have been usually going on for a really long time. How is it that those things stay hidden for so long? And why do you think it's always such a surprise, even after we've had so many of these scandals pop up? Why is it such a surprise to us when we get a new spiritual abuse allegation?
I feel like, for me, it's like, I'm no longer surprised that it happens. I'm surprised who and where and how. Um, I think the reason, back to the earlier part of your question, I think part of the reason why nobody knew, well, first of all, I think people knew. In the case of Willow Creek, we knew that they knew, but Bill Hybels had, we call them retainers around him, who would perpetuate the system. And either
Yeah.
knowingly or unknowingly, my friend Steve Carter, who was a former teaching pastor at Willow Creek, resigned in protest of how the women were being treated. Um, he was like an unknowing retainer. It was almost like he was used because of his good character. And he didn't know. He didn't know that the victims they were being managed for years. He didn't know the
Yeah.
truth of what Bill had done. So there are always, it's not just the abuser. There is maybe there are situations and I'm unaware of them, but all of the ones that we've read about and researched and spoken with in the last 3 to 4 years, it's the abuser and it's the system. We call them retainers, sycophants around the abuser who allow the system to perpetuate and continue. So there are almost always people who saw it and people who know. But they are, maybe their eyes don't want to see because it's too uncomfortable, or they have some motivating reason to stay quiet. It's hard to speak up for all the reasons we talked about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Even sometimes for the ones that are on the inner circle,
Right.
because what's going to happen if I'm no longer on the inner circle? And it takes a lot of courage, just like your friend that you talked about, the teaching pastor that left. That takes a lot of courage because they're going to come after you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you guys said in Pivot, and I want to make sure I get this right, so I paraphrase, but I wrote it down. Spiritual abusers are often unaware of what they're doing and would describe the situation very differently, but it's still abuse regardless of awareness and intent. So, as you guys talked about that, it was this idea that some spiritual abusers don't know. It's not quite what Bill was doing. It's not that kind of behavior where they knew through and through, but it's an abuse of power. It's early on, and they would fight because they believe they're doing the right thing. And that's something that we hear a lot when we talk about narcissistic systems in churches. We get a lot of pushback from pastors online who will say that's not the intent. And we have to constantly come back and say, whether it's the intent or not, it's the result. So could you talk a little bit more about that and why so many spiritual abusers don't recognize it, and what we can do to help them recognize it, what we can do to help recognize it in ourselves, and what people on the other end of it can do when they experience it and the abuser doesn't recognize it?
Well, so Jeff, I don't know that I can say it any better than you did. We hear that too. Well, that wasn't my intent. It wasn't my intent to hurt this person, or it wasn't my intent to abuse them. But like, okay, well, it wasn't your intent, but that's what happened. And frankly, if I'm being honest, saying I'm a type 8 Enneagram, so I like to challenge.
Yeah.
Frankly, frankly, saying, well, that wasn't my intent is throwing it back on to the other person. So if that's some sort of apology, it's really a non-apology. Whether or not it was my intent to be impatient with a student, I still have to own that I was a teacher who was impatient. Whether or not it was my intent doesn't matter. I feel very strongly about this.
Yeah. No. Well, so I still remember when I first reached out to the kind of pastor in charge of our situation. I said, "Hey, we need to sit down and talk. This is not okay. Like, what's going on is not okay." And all I kept getting were those non-apologies. I'm sorry that you feel that way. I'm sorry if you took it this way. And those are actually called apology gaslighting,
Yeah,
because
that's not
according to
nice.
psychologists, it's a form of gaslighting when we do that. So it's not always about the intent of our heart. And I
Right.
really do believe that a lot of these leaders think they're doing the right thing because they're so missionally driven. You got a lot of like Enneagram threes, and you got people who they believe that it's mission at all costs because the mission is to share the gospel. But what good does it do if we share the gospel and destroy people along the way,
Hmm.
break people along the way? Because the gospel is the good news. It's not just the good news that ends at salvation. It's the good news of restoration. It's the good news of healing. And I still remember I had a career psychologist that asked me this years ago, and it haunted me. It was one of the things that actually led me to doing my own work. But she said, "Jeff, you are talented and you can do anything you want in the church world or outside the church world." She said, "You're a once in a generation type of leader. You're going to be successful. You're going to reach the top of the mountain. You're going to plant the flag, whatever that is of success, and you're going to feel good about it." She said, "But if you keep leading the way you're leading now, you're going to look down and realize you're alone, and there's nothing but a trail of broken and bloody bodies behind you, people who couldn't keep up." And she asked the question, is that really success? Is that really winning? And for a lot of us, I don't think we ever stop and see that. We never have anyone challenge us in a way that we can hear, because it's the mission, it's the gospel.
Mhm.
But regardless of intent, so pastors, if you're listening, I've been there. Regardless of intent, when someone comes to you and says, what you did hurt me, right? Then it's real.
And
It's
stop.
valid.
Right. Stop and listen.
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, what does James 1:17 say? Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, or we could insert defensive in this situation. And I think that would work. Um, we talked about truth being sanitized almost, that there's a lot of spin that goes on to these stories, false narratives. Why do you think that the truth gets sanitized so much in modern church systems? And one of the things that you guys talked about in the book as well that I'd love to hear more about in this answer is that there's usually only a few people who actually know the truth, and everybody else gets a version that the kind of senior leader thinks they can handle. So why do you think it's sanitized so much, and what can we do to have more transparent cultures where kind of everybody involved in the church knows as much of the truth as they can?
Well, I think in my experience, the sanitization of the truth was done to protect reputation of people of the church. So we would see the church tell a version of it, and the facts that they told were true-ish, but out of context, it was far removed from what actually happened. Guilt, it went so far as guilt was placed on the wrong person because of the version of the little piece of it that was told. How to
Mm.
counteract that, I think this is one of my favorite chapters in a church called Tove, is the chapter that my dad wrote about Yom Kippur, and about how
Mm.
Willow Creek Harvest, you name it, completely skipped Yom Kippur. That he talked about ancient Israel in the first century, and how every year the Jewish people would go to Jerusalem to celebrate Yom Kippur, and they would collectively confess their sin. And it's as if the modern day church, I guess if you're in the Anglican tradition, or like Lent, Catholic tradition is kind of a modern day equivalent, like preparing our hearts for Easter. Um, but to completely skip over confession, repentance, corporately owning what happened, um, is skipping over Yom Kippur, is skipping over Lent and Easter. And so
Mm.
to counter the lack of truth telling and the sanitization of the church, as you called it, forming a truth telling culture, and knowing Yom Kippur, knowing the history and the depth of our faith, and developing a tradition of, we do it a little bit in the Anglican church. We stand and we corporately confess our sin, and we individually confess our sin. I think sometimes, like in other church traditions, we get away from that, where it's unfamiliar.
Hmm.
It's unfamiliar to, like, why would I need to confess this? I wasn't part of it. I wasn't here. Like, I didn't even know it was happening. Why do I have to confess that? But we all played a role in perpetuating
Yeah.
the celebrity culture, myself
Yeah.
included. I wrote about this in Pivot. I remember one time, um this is along the lines of, like, culture's like an active agent, and the people, like, the
Yeah.
leaders might feed it, but the people feed the leaders. We have an equal responsibility in it. Is I was standing in the lobby one time of Willow Creek, this is years ago, and Bill Hybels walked by with an entourage of bodyguards, and I behaved like, who's like your favorite celebrity? I mean, I behaved like it was Taylor Swift walking by. My husband's
Hmm.
like, Laura, he's our pastor, not a celebrity. And I said, yes, he is. He is a celebrity. But so perhaps he gave us that persona of importance, but I perpetuated it by treating him as one. So when we do that, we're feeding into the celebrity culture that perpetuates truth sanitizing and skipping over confession and repentance.
Well, I think about, a psychological way to describe that is we are feeding their narcissistic supply, and they're only going to continue with those narcissistic behaviors in that system if their narcissistic supply is met. And a lot of celebrity culture in churches is about that. It's about we're feeding that ego, we're feeding the need that these pastors have for meaning and for purpose, that they're getting it a lot of times from us instead of getting it from God. They know the right answers, but we're their narcissistic supply. So
Mm.
these next two questions are kind of around that, or next few questions are kind of around that. The modern church seems to attract a lot of narcissists. And again, Chuck DeGroat's book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, is fantastic on this subject. But why do you think, as you look at story after story, situation after situation, you've seen these things play out similarly, why do you think our modern church systems, what is it about them that is attracting narcissistic leaders and attracting wounded leaders who need to get that narcissistic supply?
Doesn't Chuck say that a high percentage of pastors fall somewhere on the narcissism scale? Here's my
Yeah,
theory.
that they fall higher than the average
Yeah,
person.
than the average person. Here's my personal theory. Um, I've read enough just to be a little bit dangerous on the topic. It takes a lot of ego to get up on a platform and represent God, if you will, or to say, I heard from God and here's what he said, and here's how you should apply it. It takes a certain level of ego to do that. And if your character doesn't hold up, doesn't match, it's going to take a tremendous amount of, I don't know, character to resist the temptation of celebrity. The attractional church feeds the narcissism, right? So the whole church
Mm-hmm.
service, when I left megachurch, one of the first things I noticed, I was like, I couldn't see it when I was in it. But in the megachurch, the music, the drama, the videos, clips, everything would lead up to the message of the pastor. It set that person up.
Mm-hmm.
It was all attractional about the pastor. When I left a megachurch and started attending an Anglican church, I'm like, okay, we don't even know who's speaking ahead of time. Everything leads up to communion. It leads up to the
Mm-hmm.
Eucharist. So rather than leading up to a person, it leads up to Christ and my confession
I
of
love
my
that.
sin and thanking him for the gift of restoration with him and communion with him. So that's partly my theory, is that I think a lot of the attractional churches are feeding the ego and narcissism of a person. We treat them like celebrity,
Yeah,
people treat them like
we
celebrities.
do.
We have green rooms behind. You can't get to the pastor. You have to, at Willow, I had to wait in a long line to talk to Bill. And I think I did that one time, and I remember being quickly dismissed by the bodyguard. You feel like you are talking to a very famous person.
Yeah. And we've turned this idea of honor and protection of the pastor, we kind of turned it on its head. And it's become something that, it was never meant to be. I think, I love what you talked about with the Anglican church and it all leading up to communion. And I could be totally wrong on this. So someone listening, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was an Orthodox pastor that I heard talking about it recently that said, hey, when we lead worship, we're not facing the people in the congregation because they're not our audience, right?
Mm.
They're not worshiping us. We are turned facing in the same direction as them because we're all worshiping together. We're just going to worship first in that act of leadership. And all of that is so different from the current megachurch model where, again, just being honest, there are a lot of good people in the megachurch model. And there are a lot of pastors who love people well and prepare well. And, I did a lot of good things as a pastor in the megachurch model. But I also know some of the sermons that people love the most, I wasn't prepared for those. I wasn't prayed up for those. I was just performing. I
Mm.
knew how to perform, and people couldn't tell the difference, right? So one of the things I'm looking for when I'm in churches now is, at that confidence monitor, I'm turning around to see, is it a teleprompter or is it literally just notes in case they've forgotten what they're saying? Because that's a big red flag for me. It is very easy for people to praise a good performance instead of good character. That's one of the things that kind of I've noticed over time. But one of the other key features that meets this like a bad car wreck is we're drawing more narcissists and more narcissistic personalities than ever, more performers than ever to the church. We're feeding that narcissistic supply, and at times I think creating narcissists in these narcissistic systems. At the same time, we tend to have less accountability across the board, especially in non-denom megachurch land. There's less accountability than ever, even in certain denominations like the SBC. Part of what we've seen is a lack of accountability. Um, what damage does that lack of accountability do? And how do you think we got to this place of less accountability than ever?
Well, I think it's somewhat intentional, that it's easier. I don't know. I can get away with more if I'm not accountable to somebody. So if I have, if there's just three of us that are elders and I'm the pastor and I'm one of them, I have fewer people to be accountable to. Or if I'm a non-denominational church, I don't have, like in the case of like Willow Creek, when that imploded, there wasn't a governing body that held accountability over the church or the elders or the pastor. So I think a lot of it is, sad to say, intentional, that it's part of the problem of the celebrity culture and megachurch model is there isn't accountability. Like in the Anglican church, at least when there's a problem with the pastor, there's a bishop that oversees the pastor. So there's some accountability structure in place.
It seems like a lot of pastors are going to even their elder board or their governing board are other big church pastors who don't live in their area, which makes accountability even more difficult. Um, do you think, Laura, that so much of the non-denom megachurch movement, where these large churches are still pastored by their founders, do you think that plays a role in it? Because a lot of times the founders get to set a lot of the structures in those systems.
I'm not entirely familiar with that, but I have to think it does play a role. That they're just planning on handing it down to the next, to the son or daughter. And
That's the number one
yeah,
succession strategy right
yeah,
now of megachurch pastors is which son or son-in-law is going to take it.
right. It's a little bit of, I don't know if you want to call it nepotism or not, but
I would call it nepotism, but a lot of people don't realize this. The term nepotism actually came from the church. Like we started nepotism, wanting to put, sons and nephews of bishops, you know, into power. So nepotism is a poor succession strategy. We've seen that throughout history, but it's the number one succession strategy I'm seeing across the board in these churches. I think it's doing a lot of damage because a lot of times these sons weren't actually called, but they
mm,
were just kind of born with the expectation to take this. And I think that pressure is going to cause us to see even more narcissistic tendencies if something's not done.
yeah, yeah, I agree with you on that.
All right, so I love this quote, and well, it's not really a quote, but it's this idea you talked about in Pivot. You guys talked about transforming a culture requires power. It has to have power. Power is not good or bad in a vacuum. It's how people use it. If transforming a culture requires power, what power do we have to actively start transforming the church culture right now in America? What power do parishioners and general congregants have? And then also, what power do lower level and mid level church staff have? Because we hear from both all the time who are broken over this. They want to make a difference. They don't know where to get started and they feel powerless. So, what power do we have in those situations?
After A Church Called Tove came out, this was probably our most asked question. Is people would read Tove and it resonated with a lot of folks and churches and lay people, and they would ask us, so we want a Tove church. We want a church that resists all these toxicities. We want to form a culture of goodness. And especially, how do I do it if I'm a lay person? And that question became so frequent that my dad and I looked at each other one day and were like, we have to figure out, we have to answer this question. We need to like research,
Yeah.
what can people do? And that is how Pivot started, is a practical guide to help churches transform their culture, or to build goodness into the culture. There's a lot of
Mm.
research out there about transforming culture, but not in specifically in the Christian culture. So we did quite a bit of research, especially the leading researcher on this topic is Edgar Schein, and we based a lot of Pivot on his research, but we adapted it for a Christian organization. And then our second most asked question was, well, what do I do if I'm, like you said, a mid-level staff person or a youth pastor, or if I'm a lay person? And we wrote a chapter just for you in that position in Pivot, because we recognize that the farther you are away from the power, the less influence you have over any decision making or culture. Um, and so we coined the term, my dad coined the term pockets of Tove. And so, sure, you can absolutely try
Mm.
to schedule a meeting and talk to somebody about your concerns. How far are you going to get as a person that doesn't have influence? You know, I don't know. I hope and pray that you're listened to and seen, and that your concerns are taken to heart. They may not be, and that's just the
Yeah.
reality of being far away from power. But we have encouraged our listeners and our followers to form their own pockets of Tove, to form, whether it's your small group or you're a youth pastor, your ministry, um, to form a Tove culture what you do have influence over. So you may not be able to influence the senior pastor, but maybe your ministry or your small group can live Tovely together. And hopefully over time, the Tove will spread and catch and spill over to other ministries or to the larger church. I had one of my favorite stories of the last couple of years. I was speaking at an event, and I had somebody, a reader of A Church Called Tove and Pivot, had came up and said, I wanted to tell you that we heard what you said about pockets of Tove, and we did it. We formed a
Mm.
pocket of Tove. And my heart like melted. I was like, well, there you go. Like, you
Yeah.
don't have, you accept the reality of your situation. You don't have control over what the leaders are doing, but you do have control over how you live, and you can influence those that are in community with you to live Tovely together. And one
Yeah.
fun story, she said they had a baby born in their pocket of Tove recently, and they named the baby Tove. Baby Tove.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I would love your thoughts on this, because we always need accountability. We need other people sharpening us as well. Um, we, without using the Tove language, just because up until now, a lot of our audience hasn't been familiar with that. We've tried to share that kind of as the first step, is to be the example. The other things that we've really encouraged people to do is to ask questions, not to ask like accusatory questions, but just ask good questions, and to look for the way that they're answered.
Mm,
We believe that you can tell more from the way a question is answered than anything else in a system. And if
mm,
easy questions tend to get met with spun answers or a lot of defensiveness, it kind of tells you where the culture is going. But The third thing we tell people is kind of harsh. It's kind of the nuclear option. It's the last place we want you to get. But if you try to create those pockets of Tove and the things around you are still going poorly and not changing, at some point you run the risk of that getting on you. You've asked questions and they're getting met with vitriol and defensiveness and nothing's changing. You feel like you're not being told the truth. That if you've done everything within your power, often what we'll tell people is the only power you really have at that point is to make your vote with your time, talent, and treasure, which is what churches so often these systems want most, which may mean I love the worship here and I love this pastor and their preaching, but I go to a church that doesn't have that as well because I can't support financially, can't support through service, can't support through attendance this until it changes. And again, one or two people aren't going to make that difference. But if enough of us do that when we see the red flags, they're going to start asking questions. These leaders are going to start asking questions because it squeezes so much of that narcissistic supply. Is that, what do you think about that? Is that too harsh? Are we being too harsh when we ask people to do that? Or is that, a way, if they've tried everything else, to exercise power to do their part to change the culture?
I always believe that people can leave a church. There is no reason why you have to stay in a culture that is toxic, especially if you're being mistreated or worse, abused. 100%. For some people, the Tove, the right decision, the good and right decision is to leave, is to, like you said, take your talents, take your treasure, and place them elsewhere.
Good, good. And that's something that we never want to be people's first option.
Right.
Because leaving, we kind of leave when it's the only power we have left, because we all want our churches to do well. We all want our churches to become Tove cultures. I think even a lot of the narcissistic pastors and abusive pastors, if you get them in a vacuum, they started out wanting their church to be a Tove culture. Maybe they still do, and that's gotten so twisted. So we never want people to think that's the first option, but it's definitely something that we just ran into a lot of audience members that felt like they had to stay
Mm,
because they had to stay to try to make a difference. And even my wife went through that. She stayed longer than she felt comfortable staying, trying to make a positive difference. And what it ends up doing though is a lot of times it leads to abuse if you stay too
right.
late, or it makes the abuse worse. So we want to give people
Yeah,
permission to do that, but I also, again, we want accountability and to make sure, hey, we're not being too harsh, from this thing.
right.
Last set of questions that I really want to ask you is just some advice or wisdom. And I know these are just going to be a few nuggets because I've got 4 different types of people to ask you about. But we always want to leave people with as much of a solutions oriented approach as we can, because people who've been through spiritual abuse, um, it's difficult. People who have been a part of it and realize they're complicit. We've interviewed multiple pastors with stories like that. That is difficult, and I feel that to my bones. So, just a couple of nuggets of wisdom or advice that you would have for each of these groups of people. But let's start with the senior leaders of churches. And we're not saying that they're narcissistic or abusive. These could be good leaders. But if you're the senior leader of a church, what advice would you give them for creating a Tove culture and protecting against an abusive culture?
This is very humbling because I am a public school teacher, and sometimes I have imposter syndrome sitting here in interviews like this, and people thinking like, who wants to hear what a teacher has to say about a church leader? So I recognize my lowly position in speaking into this, but I would say you have to have a good pulse on your culture. You have to know the truth of what people are experiencing. What is it like to attend church here? What is it like to work here? And the best way
Yeah.
you can do that is to take some, have your people, have your staff, have your congregation take some form of a survey. We're going through this right now in my school district. We have a new superintendent, and I give him huge credit. He wants to know what the culture of our district is like, and he wants to know, what is it like to work here? What are the positives? What are the negatives? What can I do better as your leader? And he opened up his calendar. He sent out a Google Doc. We could sign up for any time, any half hour or 1 hour time slot we wanted,
Yeah.
and just have a conversation. And his job was to listen and to take notes and to gather data.
Very cool.
And I transfer that over to our work and pivot in Tove is like, are you open to hearing the truth of what the culture is like? And if
Yeah.
you are, gather the data. And sometimes the hardest things to hear are the truth about ourselves, but are you willing to listen and hear?
And if you are a senior leader, make sure you pick up Pivot, because you guys also talk in Pivot about, making sure when you do those surveys, you don't weaponize them, because they've been misused, as well. So we've got to make sure that we listen. We got to make sure that we act, on those things when we hear them without getting defensive, without isolating people, villainizing people, for telling us the truth. What about general church staff? What would be your advice or wisdom for your church staff that we talked about? They make up the majority of the staff, but they don't have that inner circle executive leadership type influence. They're at a church, they're starting to see things, that are good and bad. What can they do to create pockets of Tove where they're at?
Ask questions of those above you, in a non-accusatory way, more like, hey, information, fact finding. I want to know about this. I'd like to know why you made this decision. How to create pockets of Tove. Well, first of all, do it with those that you work with that are within your sphere of influence or ministry. Live justly, be empathetic, tell the truth with each other, resist making decisions out of loyalty or fear. Create that pocket with those whom you serve, whom you are in community with.
Yeah, very good. Very good. I love that. So let's move. We got, two more groups. And they're all in such different places. I have a hard time just asking, for advice or wisdom for everybody, because so many of our listeners are in different places. So that's the church staff side of it. What about your parishioners? These are people who haven't been victims of spiritual abuse. They've seen the good sides of church. Maybe they've noticed people disappearing. They've seen some troubling red flags, but they've never been the victims yet. But they want to make sure their church is as healthy as it can be and that it has a Tove culture. What can they do from kind of their seat on the bus to make sure that church is healthy and to make sure that it's moving in a Tove direction?
The word that I feel like pressed on my mind and heart is the word character. Be people of good character in everything. Like, obviously the Christian path, like, we're all on a journey. But be people that are open to the Spirit, that follow where he leads, that respond in compassion, that see people and make them feel loved and heard and seen and known. That's the word pressed into my mind and my heart when you ask that question about parishioners, is develop and work on your character. Start there.
Yeah, that's good. And then the final group, this is the group that, I think my heart is for the most, just because of what they've been through. What wisdom would you share with the person who's been a victim of spiritual abuse? Whether that was just abuse of power, whether that was sexual abuse, that causes a lot of trauma, causes a lot of hurt. What would you tell them as they heal, but also want to help create safe spaces for others?
First of all, I am so sorry. That is not something that ever should have happened to any human being made in the image of God, no matter what kind of abuse it was. It should not have happened. My friend Steve Carter said something recently, and I found it to be really wise, helpful, and true. Somebody asked him if he was angry at God because he had been a victim of spiritual abuse. I don't know if he would call it, but when I read his story, I thought he was spiritually abused in the end by Willow Creek. And somebody asked him, "Are you mad at God?" And he said, "No." He said, "I've never been mad at God." He said, "God did not hurt me. 5 people he doesn't name them, but 5 people on staff hurt me, but it wasn't God. And I found such comfort and truth and hope in that, because that's what I would say to survivors of abuse, is that what happened is not God. It's not his design. It's not what he ever would want. We serve a God of compassion and truth and justice and empathy. People hurt you, but God did not. And I hope that I hope that they can know, I hope people can know that in their heart, that it's not who God is.
For sure. And if you're in a place where you say, hey, I've been through that, I don't have a safe place to talk, anywhere to go, reach out to us, whether that's on social media or go into disrupted.church. We will help you get into community, help you get into a group, give you some recommendations on, therapists. We'll do anything that we can on our end to help you be able to safely begin to heal and process that story. But Laura, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an incredible conversation. I know it's going to be helpful to a lot of people. And you are so much more than a lowly teacher. Like you and your dad, there's a reason why he asked you to be on this project, because together, the work of these 2 books, it's made an impact that you're just scratching the surface of the impact that we'll see from it. So thank you guys for this work. Thank you for being brave and courageous voices, for being a voice for the voiceless. And for all the work that you guys have put into it. I know, again, I've followed your dad's work for a while, but I appreciate you guys both, and I appreciate you being willing to join the conversation today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. It was truly my honor to meet you and to be a small part of what you're doing here. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
And if people want to follow up more with your work, or get either of the books, where's the best place to connect with you?
LauraBarringer.net. Check out my website. It's got
right.
links to everything you need.
Very easy. I love it. Guys, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. And until next time, grace and peace. But we'll see you again on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.